Book 5, Part 1 of the Memoirs of Chateaubriand, Volume 3. This is the LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicole Lee. The Memoirs of Chateaubriand, Volume 3, by François-René de Chateaubriand. Translated by Alexander Teixeira de Matos. Book 5, Part 1. I show you the wrong side of events which history does not display. History exhibits only the right side. Memoirs have the advantage of presenting both surfaces of the texture. In this respect, they depict the whole complexion of humanity better, by exposing, as in the tragedies of Shakespeare, low and exalted scenes. There is everywhere a cottage beside a palace, a man who weeps beside a man who laughs, a ragman carrying his basket beside a king losing his throne. What was the fall of Darius? To the slave present at the Battle of Arbela. Ghent, then, was only a tiring room behind the slips of the spectacle opened in Paris. Some famous personages still remained in Europe. I had, in 1800, commenced my career with Alexander and Napoleon. Why had I not followed those leading actors, my contemporaries, on the great stage? Why only at Ghent? Because heaven casts you where it wills. From the little 100 days at Ghent, let us pass to the great 100 days in Paris. I have told you the reasons which ought to have stopped Bonaparte in Elba, and the urgent reasons, or rather the necessity drawn from his nature, which compelled him to issue from exile. But the march from Cannes to Paris exhausted all that remained of the old man. In Paris, the talisman was shattered. The few moments for which the reign of lawfulness had reappeared had sufficed to render impossible the re-establishment of arbitrariness. Despotism muzzles the masses and enfranchises individuals within a certain limit. Anarchy lets loose the masses and enslaves individual independence. Hence, despotism resembles liberty when it follows after anarchy. It remains what it really is when it replaces liberty. Bonaparte, a liberator after the Constitution of the Directory, was an oppressor after the Charter. He felt this so well that he thought himself obliged to go further than Louis XVIII, and to return to the sources of national sovereignty. He, who had trodden the people under foot as its master, was reduced to create himself anew a tribune of the people, to court the favour of the suburbs, to parody the revolutionary infancy, to lisp an old language of liberty, which forced his lips into a grimace, while each syllable angered his sword. His destiny as a power was, in fact, so well accomplished, that the genius of Napoleon was no longer recognised during the 100 days. That genius was the genius of success and order, not that of defeat and liberty. Now he could do nothing through victory which had betrayed him, nothing for order, since it existed without him. In his astonishment he said, "To what a condition have the Bourbons reduced France for me in a few months! It will take me years to restore her." It was not the work of the Legitimacy which the conqueror saw, but the work of the Charter. He had left France dumb and prostrate; he found her erect and speaking. In the ingenuousness of his absolute mind, he took liberty for disorder. And yet Bonaparte was obliged to capitulate with the ideas which he was unable to conquer at first sight. In the absence of any real popularity, workmen hired at 40 sous a head came, at the end of their day's work, to howl, "Long live the Emperor!" in the carousel that was called going to the crying. Proclamations at first announced marvels of forgetting and forgiving. Individuals were declared free, the nation free, the press free. Nothing was wanted but the peace, independence and happiness of the people. The whole imperial system was changed. The golden age was about to return. In order to conform practice with theory, France was divided into 7 great police sections. The 7 lieutenants were invested with the same powers which were enjoyed under the Consulate and the Empire by the Directors General. It is well known what those protectors of individual liberty were at Lyons, Bordeaux, Milan, Florence, Lisbon, Hamburg, Amsterdam. Over these lieutenants, in a hierarchy more and more favourable to liberty, Bonaparte placed commissaries extraordinary, after the fashion of the representatives of the people under the Convention. The police, directed by Fouché, informed the world, by means of solemn proclamations, that it would thenceforward serve only to spread philosophy, that it would act only in accordance with virtuous principles. Bonaparte re-established by decree the National Guard of the kingdom. the mere name of which used formerly to make his head swim. He found himself compelled to annul the divorce pronounced under the Empire between despotism and demagogy, and to favour their renewed alliance. From this hymen was to spring, on the Champ de Mai, a liberty wearing the red cap and the turban on its head, the Mameluke's sabre in its belt, and the revolutionary axe in its hand. A liberty surrounded by the shades of those thousands of victims sacrificed on the scaffolds or in the burning campaigns of Spain and the icy deserts of Russia. Before success, the Mamelukes were Jacobins. After success, the Jacobins were to become Mamelukes. Sparta was for the moment of danger, Constantinople for that of triumph. Bonaparte would indeed have liked to recover possession for himself alone, but that was impossible for him. He found men prepared to dispute it with him. First, the earnest republicans, delivered from the chains of despotism and the laws of the monarchy, desired to retain an independence which is perhaps but a noble error. Next, the madmen of the old faction of the Mountain. These latter, humiliated at having been nothing more under the Empire than the police spies of a despot, seemed resolved to resume on their own account that liberty of doing everything of which, during 15 years, they had yielded the privilege to a master. But not the republicans, nor the revolutionaries, nor the satellites of Bonaparte were strong enough to establish their separate power, or mutually to subjugate each other. Threatened from without by an invasion, pursued from within by public opinion, they understood that, if they became divided, they were lost. In order to escape the danger, they adjourned their quarrel. Some brought their systems and illusions to the common defence, others their terror and perversity. None was in earnest in this compact. Each, once the crisis passed, resolved to turn it to his profit. All sought beforehand to make sure of the results of victory. In that awful 31, 3 enormous gamblers kept the bank by turns: liberty, anarchy and despotism, all 3 cheating and striving to win a game which was lost for all. Full of that thought, they did not proceed rigorously against a forlorn hope, which was urging on revolutionary measures. Federates had been formed in the faubourgs, and federations were being organized under stern oaths. In Brittany, Anjou, Lyonnais and Burgundy, the Marseillaise and the Carmagnole were heard sung. A club established in Paris corresponded with other clubs in the provinces. The resurrection of the Journal des Patriotes was announced. But on that side, what confidence were the resuscitated of 1793 able to inspire? Was it not known how they explained liberty, equality, the rights of man? Were they more moral, more wise, more sincere, after their enormities than before? Was it because they had tainted themselves with all the vices, that they had become capable of all the virtues? One cannot abdicate crime as easily as a crown. The brow once girt with a hideous circlet retains ineffaceable marks from its contact. The idea of reducing an ambitious man of genius from the rank of emperor to that of generalissimo or president of the Republic was a chimera. The red cap which they had fixed on the head of his busts during the 100 days would only have foreboded to Bonaparte the resumption of the diadem, were it given to the athletes who race through the world to run the same course twice. Still, some liberals of the better sort promised themselves the victory. Mistaken men like Benjamin Constant, dolts like M. Simon Sismondi, spoke of placing the Prince of Canino at the Ministry of the Interior, Lieutenant General Comte Carnot at the War Office, the Comte Merlin at the Ministry of Justice. In appearance despondent, Bonaparte made no opposition to democratic movements which, in the last result, supplied his army with conscripts. He allowed himself to be attacked in pamphlets. Caricatures repeated Elba to him as parrots cried Péron to Louis XI. They preached liberty and equality to the man escaped from prison, addressing him in the second person singular. He listened to these remonstrances with an air of compunction. Suddenly, bursting the shackles in which they had pretended to bind him, he proclaimed, by his own authority, not a plebeian constitution, but an aristocratic constitution, an additional act to the constitutions of the Empire. The contemplated republic was changed by this adroit piece of juggling into the old imperial government, rejuvenated with feudality. The additional act lost Bonaparte the Republican party and made malcontents in almost all the other parties. Licence reigned in Paris, anarchy in the provinces. The civil and military authorities contended with each other. Here men threatened to burn the manors and murder the priests. There they hoisted the white flag and shouted, "Long live the king!" Finding himself attacked, Bonaparte retreated. He withdrew the nomination of the mayors of communes from his commissaries extraordinary and restored that nomination to the people. Alarmed at the multiplicity of negative votes against the Additional Act, he abandoned his de facto dictatorship and convened the Chamber of Representatives by virtue of that act which was not yet accepted. Blundering from rock to rock, he was scarcely delivered from one danger before stumbling against another. The sovereign of a day, how was he to establish an hereditary peerage which the spirit of equality repelled? How to govern the two chambers? Would they yield a passive obedience? What would be the relations of the Chambers with the proposed assembly of the Chambre de Mai, which had no real object, since the Additional Act was brought into operation before the suffrages had been counted? Would that assembly, consisting of 30,000 electors, not believe itself to be the representatives of the nation? This Chambre de Mai, so pompously announced and celebrated on the 1st of June, resolved itself into a simple march-past of troops and a distribution of colours before a despised altar. Napoleon, surrounded by his brothers, the state dignitaries, the marshals, the civil and judicial bodies, proclaimed the sovereignty of the people in which he did not believe. The citizens had imagined that they themselves would frame a constitution. On that solemn day, the peaceful middle class expected that then would be declared Napoleon's abdication in favour of his son, an abdication concocted at Bâle between the agents of Fouché and of Prince Metternich. And there was nothing but a ridiculous political trap. The Additional Act, for the rest, stood forth as an act of homage to the legitimacy, save for a few differences and in particular excluding the abolition of confiscation. It was the Charter. Those sudden changes, that confounding of all things, announced the last struggles of despotism. Nevertheless, the Emperor could not receive the death-stroke from within, for the power which was combating him was as debilitated as himself. The revolutionary Titan, whom Napoleon had floored of old, had not recovered his native energy. The two giants were now aiming useless blows at one another. It was nothing more than the contest of two shadows. To these general impossibilities were added, for Bonaparte, domestic tribulations and palace cares. He announced to France the return of the Empress and the King of Rome, and neither one nor the other came back. Speaking of the Queen of Holland, who, thanks to Louis XVIII, had become Duchesse de Saint-Leu, he said, "When one has accepted the prosperity of a family, one must embrace its adversity." Joseph, who had hastened from Switzerland, only asked him for money. Lucien alarmed him through his liberal connections. Murat, after first conspiring against his brother-in-law, had been in too great a hurry, on returning to him, to attack the Austrians. Stripped of the kingdom of Naples, a runaway of ill omen, he was awaiting under arrest near Marseilles the catastrophe which I will describe to you later. And then, was the Emperor able to trust his former partisans and his self-styled friends? Had they not infamously abandoned him at the moment of his fall? That Senate, which formerly crawled at his feet, now ensconced in the peerage, had it not decreed its benefactor's deposition? Could he believe those men when they came and said to him, "The interests of France are inseparable from your own. If fortune betrays your efforts, reverses, sire, would not impair our perseverance and would redouble our attachment to your person." Your perseverance? Your attachment redoubled by misfortune? You said this on the 11th of June, 1815. What had you said on the 2nd of April, 1814? What will you say a few weeks later, on the 19th of July, 1815? The Ministry of the Imperial Police was in correspondence, as you have seen, with Ghent, Vienna and Bâle. The marshals to whom Bonaparte was compelled to give the command of his soldiers had but now taken the oath to Louis XVIII. They had issued the most violent proclamation against him, Bonaparte. Since that time, it is true, they had re-espoused their sultan. But if he had been arrested at Grenoble, what would they have done with him? Is it enough to break an oath to restore its whole strength to another violated oath? Are two perjuries equivalent to one fidelity? A few days more, and those swearers of the Chambre de Mai will carry back their devotion to Louis XVIII. In the halls of the Tuileries. They will approach the sacred table of the God of Peace, in order to have themselves appointed ministers at the banquets of war, heralds at arms and brandishers of the royal insignia at the coronation of Bonaparte, They will fulfil the same functions at the coronation of Charles X. Then, as the commissaries of another power, they will lead that king a prisoner to Cherbourg, scarce finding a little corner free in their consciences to hang up in it the badge of their new oath. It is hard to be born in times of improbity, in those days when two men talking together study how to keep back words from their tongue, for fear of offending each other and of mutually making one another blush. Those who had not been able to tie themselves to Napoleon by his glory, who had not been able to adhere from gratitude to the benefactor from whom they had received their riches, their honours, and their very names, were they likely to sacrifice themselves now to his needy hopes? Would they link themselves to a precarious and reincipient fortune, the ingrates whom a fortune consolidated by unexampled successes and by a possession of 16 years of victories had failed to fix? So many chrysalids who, between two springtimes, had put off and put on, shed and resumed the skin of the Legitimist and the Revolutionary, of the Napoleonist and the Bourbonist. So many words given and broken, so many crosses moved from the knight's breast to the horse's tail, and from the horse's tail to the knight's breast, so many doughty warriors changing their banners and strewing the lists with their pledges of perjured faith, so many noble dames, the attendants by turns of Marie-Louise and Marie-Caroline, were calculated to leave in the depths of Napoleon's heart naught but distrust, horror, and contempt. That great man grown old stood alone among all those traitors, men and fortune, on a tottering earth, under a hostile sky, in front of his accomplished destiny and the judgment of God. Napoleon had found no faithful friends, but the phantoms of his past glory. These escorted him, as I have told you, from the spot at which he landed to the capital of France. But the eagles which had flown from steeple to steeple, from Cannes to Paris, alighted wearily upon the chimneys of the Tuileries, able to go no further. Napoleon did not hurl himself at the head of the roused populace upon Belgium before an Anglo-Prussian army had assembled there. He stopped. He tried to negotiate with Europe, and humbly to maintain the treaties of the Legitimacy. The Congress of Vienna urged against M. le Duc de Vicence the abdication of the 11th of April, 1814. By that abdication, Bonaparte recognised that he was the sole obstacle to the restoration of peace in Europe, and consequently renounced, for himself and his heirs, the thrones of France and Italy. Now, since he had come to restore his power, he was manifestly violating the Treaty of Paris, and placing himself again in the political situation anterior to the 31st of March, 1814. Therefore it was he, Bonaparte, who was declaring war against Europe, and not Europe against Bonaparte. These logical quibbles of diplomatic attorneys, as I remarked in connection with M. de Talleyrand's letter, were worth what they might be before the battle. The news of Bonaparte's landing at Cannes had reached Vienna on the 6th of March, in the middle of an entertainment at which was represented the assembly of the divinities of Olympus and Parnassus. Alexander had just received the proposal for an alliance between France, Austria and England. He hesitated a moment between the two pieces of intelligence, and then said, "The question is not of myself, but of the safety of the world." And an estafette carried orders to St. Petersburg to dispatch the guards. The withdrawing armies stopped short, their long line faced about, and 800,000 enemies turned their eyes towards France. Bonaparte prepared for war. He was expected in New Catalonian fields. God had summoned him to the battle which was to put an end to the reign of battles. The heat of the wings of the renown of Marengo and Austerlitz had sufficed to hatch armies in that France which is one great nest of soldiers. Bonaparte had restored to his legions their epithets of invincible, terrible, and incomparable. 7 armies resumed the titles of armies of the Pyrenees, of the Alps, of the Jura, the Moselle, the Rhine, great memories which served as a frame for supposed troops, for expected triumphs. A real army was mustered in Paris and at Laon. 150 mounted batteries, 10,000 picked soldiers entered into the guards, 18,000 sailors distinguished at Lutzen and Bautzen, 30,000 veterans, officers and non-commissioned officers in garrison in the fortified towns, 7 departments in the north and east ready to rise in a body, 180,000 men of the National Guard mobilized, volunteer corps in Lorraine, Alsace and Franche-Comté, federates offering their pikes and their strength, Paris turning out 3,000 muskets a day. Those were the Emperor's resources. Perhaps he might yet once more have overturned the world, had he been able to resolve, while liberating the country, to summon the foreign nations to independence. The moment was propitious. The kings, after promising their subjects constitutional government, had shamefully gone from their word. But liberty was distasteful to Napoleon, since he had drunk of the cup of power. He preferred to be vanquished with soldiers rather than to vanquish with peoples. The army corps which he successively sent towards the Netherlands amounted to 70,000 men. We emigrants, in the city of Charles V., were like the women of that city. Seated behind their windows, they watched the soldiers, in a little slanting mirror, passing down the street. Louis XIII. Was there in a corner, completely forgotten. Scarcely did he from time to time receive a note from the Prince de Talleyrand returning from Vienna, a few lines from the members of the diplomatic body resident about the Duke of Wellington as commissaries, Messieurs Pozzo di Borgo, de Vincent, etc., etc. They had plenty to do besides thinking of us. A man unacquainted with politics would never have believed that an impotent hidden on the banks of the Lys would be flung back upon the throne by the collision of thousands of soldiers ready to cut each other's throats, soldiers of whom he was neither the king nor the general, who were not thinking of him, who knew of neither his name nor his existence. Of two such close spots as Ghent and Waterloo, never did one appear so dim, the other so dazzling. The legitimacy lay in the storehouse, like an old broken wagon. We knew that Bonaparte's troops were approaching. To cover us, we had only 2 little companies under the orders of the Duc de Berry, a prince whose blood could not avail us, for it was already demanded elsewhere. 1,000 horse, detached from the French army, would have carried us off in a few hours. The fortifications of Ghent were demolished. The enceinte which remained would have been the more easily carried in that the Belgian population was not in our favour. The scene which I had witnessed at the Tuileries was repeated. His Majesty's carriages were secretly got ready. The horses were ordered. We faithful ministers would have splashed after by God's grace. Monsieur left for Brussels, charged to watch the movements from near at hand. Monsieur de Blacas had become anxious and melancholy. I, poor man, consoled him. People in Vienna were not favourably disposed to him. Monsieur de Talleyrand laughed at him. The Royalists accused him of being the cause of Napoleon's return. Thus, whatever happened, no further honoured exile for him in England, no further possibility of first places in France. I was his only support. I used to meet him pretty often in the horse market, where he trotted about alone. Harnessing myself to his side, I fell in with his sad thought. This man, whom I have defended at Ghent and in England, whom I defended in France after the 100 Days, and even in the preface to the Monarchie selon la Charte, has always been adverse to me. That would be nothing, if he had not been an evil for the monarchy. I do not repent my past simplicity, but I am bound in these memoirs to rectify the surprises sprung upon my judgment and my good heart. On the 18th of June 1815, I left Ghent at noon by the Brussels gate. I was going to finish my walk alone on the high road. I had taken Cæsar's Commentaries with me, and I strolled slowly along, immersed in my reading. I was more than a league from the town, when I thought I heard a dull rumbling. I stopped, looked up at the sky, which was fairly laden with clouds, taking counsel with myself whether I should continue to walk on, or go back towards Ghent for fear of a storm. I listened. I heard nothing more save the cry of a moorhen in the rushes and the sound of a village clock. I pursued my way. I had not taken 30 steps before the rumbling began again, now short, now long, and at irregular intervals. Sometimes it was perceptible only through a trembling of the air, which communicated itself to the ground over those immense plains, so distant was it. Those detonations, less extensive, less undulating, less connected than those of thunder, gave rise in my mind to the idea of a battle. I found myself in front of a poplar planted at the corner of a hop field. I crossed the road and leant erect against the trunk of the tree, my face turned in the direction of Brussels. A southerly wind springing up carried to me more distinctly the sound of artillery. That great battle, nameless as yet, of which I listened to the echoes at the foot of a poplar, and of which a village clock had just rung out the unknown funerals, was the Battle of Waterloo. A silent and solitary hearer of the formidable judgment of the destinies, I should have been less moved if I had found myself in the fray. The peril, the fire, the press of death would have left me no time for meditation. But, alone under a tree in the fields of Ghent, like the shepherd of the flocks which passed around me, I was overwhelmed by the weight of my reflections. What was that battle? Was it decisive? Was Napoleon there in person? Were lots being cast upon the world as upon Christ's vesture? In the event of success or reverse for one side or the other, what would be the consequence for the nations? Liberty or slavery? But what blood was flowing? Was not each sound that reached my ear the last sigh of a Frenchman? Was it a new Crécy, a new Poitiers, A new Agincourt in which France's most implacable enemies were about to revel? If they triumphed, was not our glory lost? If Napoleon won the day, what became of our liberty? Although a success on Napoleon's side opened up to me an eternal exile, the motherland at that moment gained the mastery in my heart. My prayers were for the oppressor of France if, while saving our honour, he was to snatch us from foreign domination. Was Wellington triumphing? Then the Legitimacy would re-enter Paris behind those red uniforms which had just renewed their dye in the blood of the French. Then the royalty would have, as state carriages at its coronation, the ambulance wagons filled with our maimed grenadiers. What manner of restoration would it be, accomplished under such auspices? That is but a very small portion of the ideas that tormented me. Each gunshot gave me a shock and doubled the beating of my heart. At a few leagues from an immense catastrophe, I did not see it. I could not touch the huge funeral monument growing minute by minute at Waterloo, even as from the shore of Boulac, on the bank of the Nile, I had vainly stretched out my hands towards the pyramids. No traveller appeared. A few women in the fields, peacefully weeding rows of vegetables, did not seem to hear the noise to which I was listening. But see, a courier came riding up. I left the foot of my tree and placed myself in the middle of the road. I stopped the courier and questioned him. He belonged to the Duc de Berry and came from Alost. Bonaparte entered Brussels yesterday, 17th June, after a sanguinary combat. The battle was to have recommenced today, 18th June. They think the Allies have suffered a decisive defeat, and the order is given to retreat. The courier continued his road. I followed him, hastening my steps. I was passed by the carriage of a merchant who was fleeing post with his family. He confirmed the courier's story. All was in confusion when I returned to Ghent. They were closing the gates of the city. Only the wickets remained half opened. Ill-armed civilians and a few soldiers in depot were keeping sentry. I went to the King's. Monsieur had just arrived by a circuitous route. He had left Brussels upon the false news that Bonaparte was about to enter it, and that a first lost battle left no hope of winning a second. They were saying that, as the Prussians had not formed their lines, the English had been crushed. At these bulletins, the stampede became general. The possessors of some resources left. I, who am accustomed never to have anything, was always ready and prepared. I wanted to let Madame de Chateaubriand move out before me. She was a great Bonapartist, but did not like cannon shots. She refused to leave me. In the evening, council at His Majesty's. We heard Monsieur's reports over again, as well as the on dit picked up at the military commandant's or at the Baron d'Eckstein's. The wagon to contain the crown diamonds was put to. I had no need of a wagon to remove my treasure. I put the black silk handkerchief in which I wrapped my head at night into my flaccid Minister of the Interior's portfolio, and placed myself at the Sovereign's disposal, with that important document of the affairs of the Legitimacy. I was richer in my first emigration, when my knapsack did duty as my pillow, and served as a swaddling band for Atala. But in 1815, Atala was a big, gawky little girl of 13 or 14, who was going about alone in the world, and who, to her father's honour, had got herself too much talked about. On the 19th of June, at 1 o'clock in the morning, a letter from M. Pozzo, brought to the King by express, re-established the truth of the facts. Bonaparte had never entered Brussels. He had decidedly lost the Battle of Waterloo. Leaving Paris on the 12th of June, he joined his army on the 14th. On the 15th, he forced the enemy's lines on the Sambre. On the 16th, he beat the Prussians in those plains of Fleurus, where victory seems to be always faithful to the French. The villages of Ligny and Saint-Amand were carried. At Quatre-Bras, a further success, the Duke of Brunswick remained among the dead. Blücher, in full retreat, fell back upon a reserve of 30,000 men under the orders of General Bülow. The Duke of Wellington, with the English and Dutch, set his back against Brussels. On the morning of the 18th, before the first gun had been fired, the Duke of Wellington declared that he would be able to hold out until 3 o'clock, but that, at that time, if the Prussians did not come into sight, he would necessarily be destroyed. Driven back upon Planchenoit and Brussels, he was shut out from all retreat. He had been surprised by Napoleon. His strategic position was detestable. He had accepted it and had not chosen it. The French at first, on the left wing of the enemy, took the heights commanding the Château d'Hougoumont, as far as the farms of the Haie Sainte and Papelotte. On the right wing, they attacked the village of Mont Saint-Jean. The farm of the Haie Sainte was carried in the centre by Prince Jerome. But the Prussian reserves appeared in the direction of Saint-Lambert at 6 o'clock in the evening. A new and furious attack was delivered upon the village of the Haie Sainte. Blücher arrived with fresh troops and cut off the squares of the Imperial Guard from the rest of our forces. Around this immortal phalanx, the torrent of fugitives carried all with it among waves of dust, fiery smoke and grape-shot, in darkness ploughed with Congreve rockets, amid the roar of 300 pieces of artillery and the headlong gallop of 25,000 horses. It was, as it were, the summary of all the battles of the Empire. Twice the French shouted "Victory!" and twice their shouts were stifled under the pressure of the enemy's columns. The fire from our lines died out, the cartridges were exhausted. Some wounded grenadiers, amid 30,000 slain and 100,000 blood-stained cannonballs, cooled and conglomerated at their feet, remained erect, leaning on their muskets, with broken bayonets and empty barrels. Not far from them, the man of battles listened, with a fixed stare, to the last cannon shot he was to hear in his life. In that field of carnage, his brother Jerome was still fighting with his expiring battalions overwhelmed by numbers, but his courage was unable to retrieve the victory. The number of killed on the side of the Allies was estimated at 18,000 men, on the side of the French at 25,000. 1,200 British officers had perished. Almost all the Duke of Wellington's aides-de-camp were killed or wounded. There was not a family in England but went into mourning. The Prince of Orange was hit by a bullet in the shoulder. The Baron de Vincent, the Austrian ambassador, was shot through the hand. The English were beholden for the success to the Irish and to the Highland Brigade, whom our cavalry charges were unable to break. General Grouchy's corps, not having advanced, was not present in the action. The two armies crossed steel and fire with a valour and desperation inspired by a national enmity of 10 centuries. Lord Castlereagh, giving an account of the battle in the House of Lords, said, "The British and French soldiers, after the action, washed their blood-stained hands in the same stream, and from opposite banks congratulated each other on their courage." Wellington had always been baleful to Bonaparte, or rather the rival genius to France, the English genius, barred the road to victory. Today, the Prussians lay claim to the honour of this decisive battle as against the English, but in war it is not the action accomplished but the name that makes the triumpher. It was not Bonaparte who won the real Battle of Jena. The blunders of the French were important. They made mistakes as to friendly or hostile bodies. They occupied the position of Chateaubriand too late. Marshal Grouchy, whose instructions were to hold the Prussians in check with his 36,000 men, allowed them to pass without seeing them. Hence the reproaches which our generals cast at one another. Bonaparte attacked in front, according to his custom, instead of turning the English, and, with a master's presumption, occupied himself in cutting off the retreat of an enemy who was not beaten. Many falsehoods and some rather curious truths have been retailed concerning this catastrophe. The phrase, "the guard dies but does not surrender," is an invention which no one dares now to defend. It appears to be certain that, at the commencement of the action, Soult made some strategic observations to the Emperor, and that Napoleon replied, dryly, "Because Wellington defeated you, you persist in thinking him a great general." At the end of the fighting, M. de Turenne urged Bonaparte to retire, to avoid falling into the hands of the enemy. Bonaparte, emerging from his thoughts as from a dream, at first flew into a passion, then suddenly, in the midst of his rage, he flung himself upon his horse and fled. On the 19th of June, a salute of 100 guns at the Invalides announced the successes of Ligny, Charleroi and Quatre-Bras. They were celebrating victories that had died the day before at Waterloo. The first messenger to bring to Paris the news of this defeat, one of the greatest in history in its results, was Napoleon himself. He re-entered the barriers on the night of the 21st, as who should say returning from his shades, to inform his friends that he was no more. He stayed at the Élysée-Bourbon. When he arrived from Elba, he had stayed at the Tuileries. Those refuges instinctively chosen revealed the change in his destiny. Fallen in a noble fight abroad, Napoleon had, in Paris, to endure the assaults of the advocates who wished to exploit his misfortunes. He regretted that he had not dissolved the Chamber before his departure for the army. He often also repented that he had not had Fouché and Talleyrand shot. But it is certain that Bonaparte, after Waterloo, forbade himself any kind of violence, whether because he obeyed the natural calm of his temperament or because he was daunted by fate. He no longer said, as before his first abdication, "They shall see what the death of a great man is." The time for that spirited language was past. Opposed as he was to liberty, he thought of breaking up the Chamber of Representatives, presided over by Lanjuinais, who from a citizen became a senator, from a senator a peer, who since became a citizen again, and who from a citizen was about again to become a peer. General Lafayette, deputy, read from the tribune a motion declaring the Chamber in permanent session. Any attempt to dissolve it a crime of high treason, Whosoever should be guilty of it a traitor to the country, and to be tried as such. 21st June, 1815. The general's speech began with these words: "Gentlemen, now when for the first time since many years I raise a voice which the old friends of liberty will still recognise, I feel called upon to speak to you of the danger of the country. This is the time to rally round the tricolour flag, the flag of '89, the flag of liberty, equality, and public order." The anachronism of this speech caused a momentary illusion. People thought they saw the Revolution, personified by Lafayette, rise from the tomb and stand pale and wrinkled in the tribune. But those motions of order, revived after Mirabeau, were now no more than worn-out weapons taken from an old arsenal. If Lafayette nobly united the end and the commencement of his life, it was not in his power to weld together the two ends of the broken chain of time. Benjamin Constant waited on the Emperor at the Élysée Bourbon. He found him in his garden. The crowd was filling the Avenue de Marigny and shouting, "Long live the Emperor!" a touching cry coming from the popular heart. It was addressed to the vanquished. Bonaparte said to Benjamin Constant, "What duty do these owe me? I found them and left them poor." This is perhaps the only speech that came from his heart, if, nevertheless, the deputies' emotion did not deceive his hearing. Bonaparte, foreseeing the event, anticipated the summons they were preparing to serve on him. He abdicated so as not to be compelled to abdicate. "My political life is ended," he said. "I declare my son Emperor of the French under the name of Napoleon II." A useless disposition, like that of Charles X. in favour of Henry V. One gives crowns only when one possesses them, and men upset the will of adversity. Moreover, the Emperor was no more sincere on descending the throne a second time than he had been in his first retirement. When the French commissaries went to inform the Duke of Wellington that Napoleon had abdicated, he replied, "I knew that a year ago." The Chamber of Representatives, after some debates in which Manuel addressed the House, accepted its sovereign's new abdication, but vaguely and without appointing a regency. An executive commission was created. The Duc d'Otrante presided over it. 3 ministers, a councillor of state and a general of the Emperor's composed it and stripped their master once more. These were Fouché, Caulaincourt, Carnot, Quinet and Grenier. During these transactions, Bonaparte was turning over his ideas in his head. "I have no army left," he said. "I have nothing but fugitives. The majority of the Chamber of Deputies are good. I have only Lafayette, Lanjuinais and a few others against me. If the nation rises, the enemy will be crushed. If, instead of rising, they quarrel, all will be lost. The nation has not sent deputies to overthrow me, but to support me. I am not afraid of them, whatever they may do. I shall always be the idol of the people and the army. If I were to say a word, they would be beaten to death. But if we quarrel, instead of acting in concert, we shall meet with the fate of the Lower Empire." A deputation from the Chamber of Representatives having come to congratulate him on his new abdication, he replied, "I thank you. I wish that my abdication may bring happiness to France, but I am not hopeful." He repented soon after, when he heard that the Chamber of Representatives had appointed a commission of government composed of 5 members. He said to the ministers, "I have not abdicated in favour of a new Directory. I have abdicated in favour of my son. If they do not proclaim him, my abdication is null and void. It is not by appearing before the Allies with hang-dog looks and bent knee that the Chambers will force them to recognise the national independence." He complained that Lafayette, Sébastien, Pontécoulant, Benjamin Constant had conspired against him, that, besides, the Chambers had not enough energy. He said that he alone could repair all, but that the leaders would never consent, that they would rather be swallowed up in the abyss than unite with him, Napoleon, to close it. On the 27th of June, at the Malmaison, he wrote this sublime letter: "In abdicating the power, I did not renounce the citizen's noblest right, the right of defending my country. In these grave circumstances, I offer my services as a general, regarding myself still as the first soldier of the motherland." The Duc de Bassano, having represented to him that the Chambers would not be for him: "Then I see," he said, "one must always give in. That infamous Fouché is deceiving you. Only Caulaincourt and Carnot are worth anything. But what can they do with a traitor, Fouché, and 2 simpletons, Quinet and Grenier, and 2 Chambers which do not know what they want? You all believe, like fools, in the fine promises of the foreigners. You believe they will set the pot boiling, and that they will give you a prince of their making, do you not? You are wrong." Plenipotentiaries were sent to the Allies. On the 29th of June, Napoleon demanded 2 frigates stationed at Rochefort to take him out of France. Meanwhile, he had retired to the Malmaison. The debates in the House of Peers were lively. Long an enemy of Bonaparte, Carnot, who signed the order for the massacres of Avignon without having time to read it, had found time during the 100 Days to immolate his republicanism to the title of Count. On the 22nd of June, he had read in the Luxembourg a letter from the Minister of War containing an exaggerated report on the military resources of France. Ney, newly arrived, was unable to hear this report unangered. Napoleon, in his bulletins, had spoken of the Marshal with ill-disguised dissatisfaction, and Gourgaud accused Ney of being the chief cause of the loss of the Battle of Waterloo. Ney rose and said: "The report is untrue, untrue in every respect. Grouchy can have only 20 to 25,000 men under his orders, at the most. There is not a single soldier of the Guard left to be rallied. I commanded it, I saw it slaughtered bodily before leaving the battlefield. The enemy is at Nivelles with 80,000 men. He can be in Paris in 6 days. You have no other means of saving the country than to open negotiations." The aide de camp Flahault endeavoured to support the report of the Minister of War. Ney replied with fresh vehemence: "I repeat, you have no other way of safety except negotiation. You must recall the Bourbons. As for myself, I shall retire to the United States." At these words, Lavalette and Carnot overwhelmed the Marshal with reproaches. Ney replied with disdain: "I am not one of those men to whom their own interest is everything. What have I to gain by the return of Louis XVIII? To be shot for the crime of desertion. But I owe the truth to my country." In the sitting of the Peers of the 23rd, General Drouot, recalling this scene, said: "I heard with regret what was said yesterday to disparage the glory of our arms, to exaggerate our disasters and disparage our resources. My astonishment was so much the greater because those speeches were delivered by a distinguished general who, through his great valour and his military attainments, had so often deserved the gratitude of the nation." In the sitting of the 22nd, a second storm had burst out at the heel of the first. The question was Bonaparte's abdication. Lucien was insisting that his nephew should be recognised as emperor. M. de Pontécoulant interrupted the speaker and asked by what right Lucien, a foreigner and a Roman prince, permitted himself to give a sovereign to France. "How," he added, "can we recognise a child living in a foreign country?" At this question, l'Abbé Doyer, speaking excitedly from his seat: "I have heard voices around the throne of the fortunate sovereign. They withdraw from it today when he is unfortunate. There are people who do not want to recognise Napoleon II, because they want to receive the law from the foreigner, to whom they give the name of allies. Napoleon's abdication is indivisible. If he refuse to recognise his son, he must remain, sword in hand, surrounded by Frenchmen who have shed their blood for him, and who are still all covered with wounds. He will be abandoned by base generals who have already betrayed him. But if you declare that every Frenchman who deserts his flag shall be covered with infamy, his house razed to the ground, his family outlawed, then there will be no more traitors, no more intrigues such as have occasioned the late catastrophes, some of whose authors are perhaps sitting among us." The House rose in an uproar. "Order! Order! Order!" they bellowed, feeling the thrust. "Young man, you forget yourself," cried Masséna. "Do you think you are still in the guard-room?" asked Lameth. All the portents of the Second Restoration were threatening. Bonaparte had returned at the head of 400 Frenchmen. Louis XVIII. Was returning behind 400,000 foreigners. He passed near the bloody pool of Waterloo to go to Saint Denis, as though to his funeral. It was while the Legitimacy was thus advancing that the interpellations of the House of Peers resounded. They contained something, I know not what, of those terrible revolutionary scenes of the great days of our troubles, when the dagger was passed round on the bench from hand to hand among the victims. A few soldiers whose baleful fascination had brought about the ruin of France, by producing the second foreign invasion, struggled on the threshold of the palace. Their prophetic despair, their gestures, their words from the tomb, seemed to announce a treble death: death to themselves, death to the man whom they had blessed, death to the man whom they had proscribed. End of Book 5, Part 1. Book 5, Part 2 of the Memoirs of Chateaubriand, Volume 3. This is the LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicole Lee. The Memoirs of Chateaubriand, Volume 3, by François-René de Chateaubriand, translated by Alexander Teixeira de Matos, Book 5, Part 2. While Bonaparte was retiring to the Malmaison with the finished empire, we were leaving Ghent with the recommencing monarchy. Pozzo, who knew how little question of the legitimacy there was in high places, hastened to write to Louis XVIII. To set out and arrive in good time, if he wished to reign before the place was taken. It was to that note that Louis XVIII. Owed his crown in 1815. At Mons, I missed the first occasion of fortune in my political career. I was my own obstacle, and I found myself incessantly in my way. This time my good qualities played me the ill turn which my faults might have done me. M. de Talleyrand, in all the pride of a negotiation which had enriched him, claimed that he had rendered the greatest services to the legitimacy and was returning as the master. Astonished that they had not already followed, for the return to Paris, the road which he had traced out, he was much more dissatisfied to find M. de Blacas still with the king. He looked upon M. de Blacas as the scourge of the monarchy. But this was not the real motive of his aversion. He beheld in M. de Blacas the favourite, and consequently the rival. He also feared Monsieur, and had flown into a passion when, a fortnight earlier, Monsieur had made him an offer of his hotel on the Lys. To ask for M. de Blacas' removal was most natural; to demand it was too reminiscent of Bonaparte. M. de Talleyrand drove into Mons at 6 o'clock in the evening, accompanied by the Abbé Louis. M. de Rissé, M. de Jaucourt, and a few other boon companions flew to him, full of an ill humour such as he had never yet displayed. The ill humour of a king who believes his authority to have been slighted, he refused at first to go to Louis XVIII., replying to those who urged him to do so with his ostentatious phrase, "I am never in a hurry; it will be time enough tomorrow." I went to see him. He tried upon me all those wheedling tricks with which he used to seduce small ambitious men and important nincompoops. He took me by the arm, leant upon me while he spoke to me, familiarities denoting high favour, and calculated to turn my head, although with me they were quite lost. I did not even understand. I invited him to come to the King's, where I was going. Louis XVIII. Was in one of his great sorrows. It was a question of parting with M. de Blacas. The latter could not return to France; opinion had risen against him. Although I had had reason to complain of the favourite in Paris, I had displayed no resentment towards him at Ghent. The King had been pleased with my conduct. In his emotion he treated me marvellously well. M. de Talleyrand's remarks had already been repeated to him. "He boasts," he said to me, "of having a second time put back the crown on my head, and he threatens to go back again to Germany. What do you think of that, M. de Chateaubriand?" I replied: "Your Majesty must have been misinformed. M. de Talleyrand is only tired. If the King consents, I will return to see the minister." The King appeared gratified. What he liked least was worries. He longed for his repose, even at the expense of his affections. M. de Talleyrand, in the midst of his flatterers, was more arrogant than ever. I represented to him that, at so critical a moment, he could not dream of going away. Pozzo preached at him in the same sense. Although he had not the slightest inclination for him, he liked, at that moment, to see him at the head of affairs, as an old acquaintance. Besides, he believed him to be in favour with the Tsar. I made no headway on M. de Talleyrand's mind. The Prince's familiars fought against me. Even M. Mounier thought that M. de Talleyrand ought to retire. The Abbé Louis, who snapped at everybody, said to me, shaking his jaw 3 times, "If I were the Prince, I should not remain a quarter of an hour at Mons." I answered: "Monsieur l'Abbé, you and I can go where we please; no one will notice us. It is different with M. de Talleyrand." I insisted again, and said to the Prince: "Do you know that the King is continuing his journey?" M. de Talleyrand appeared surprised, and then said to me loftily, as did the Balafré to those who wished to put him on his guard against the designs of Henry III., "He will not dare." I returned to the King's, where I found M. de Blacas. I told His Majesty to excuse his minister, that he was ill, but that he would most certainly have the honour of paying his court to the King the next day. "As he pleases," replied Louis XVIII. "I leave at 3 o'clock." And then he added these words, in an affectionate tone: "I am going to part with M. de Blacas; the place will be vacant, M. de Chateaubriand." It was the royal household laid at my feet. A wary politician would have ceased to trouble his head about M. de Talleyrand, and would have had the horses put to his carriage to follow or precede the King. I remained stupidly at my inn. M. de Talleyrand, unable to persuade himself that the King would go, had gone to bed. At 3 o'clock they woke him to tell him that the King was starting. He could not believe his ears. "Tricked! Betrayed!" he cried. They got him out of bed, and there he was, for the first time in his life, in the street at 3 o'clock in the morning, leaning on M. de Ricet's arm. He reached the King's house. The two leaders of the team had already half their bodies through the gateway. The people motioned to the postillion to pull up. The King asked what was the matter. They cried, "Sire, it is M. de Talleyrand." "He is asleep," said Louis XVIII. "He is here, sire." "Come on," replied the King. The horses moved backward with the carriage. The door was opened. The King got down and dragged himself back to his apartment, followed by the limping minister. There M. de Talleyrand began an angry explanation. His Majesty listened to him and answered, "Prince de Bénévent, so you are leaving us? The waters will do you good. You must send us your news." The King left the Prince open-mouthed, had himself taken back to his berlin, and drove away. M. de Talleyrand was foaming with rage. Louis XVIII.'s composure had staggered him. He, M. de Talleyrand, who prided himself so greatly on his composure, to be beaten on his own ground, given the slip on a square at Mons, like the most insignificant of men. He could not get over it. He remained dumb, watched the coach moving off, and then, seizing the Duc de Lévis by a button of his spencer, "Go, Monsieur le Duc, go and say how I am treated. I have put back the crown on the King's head. He was always harking back to that crown. And I am going back to Germany to begin the new emigration." M. de Lévis, listening absent-mindedly, lifting himself on his toes, said, "Prince, I am going. The King must have at least one great lord with him." M. de Lévis flung himself into a hired carriole which was conveying the Chancellor of France. The two grandees of the Capetian monarchy were going, side by side, to catch it up, sharing expenses in a Merovingian benna. I had asked M. de Duras to endeavour to effect a reconciliation and to send me the first news of it. "What?" said M. de Duras. "You are remaining behind, after what the King said to you?" M. de Blacas, when leaving Mons in his turn, thanked me for the interest I had shown him. I went back and found M. de Talleyrand embarrassed. He was now regretting that he had not followed my advice and that, like a wrong-headed subaltern, he had refused to go to the King in the evening. He feared that arrangements would be made without him, that he would not be able to participate in the political power and to profit by the financial jobbing which was preparing. I told him that, although I differed from his opinion, I remained none the less attached to him as an ambassador to his minister, that, besides, I had friends with the King, and that I hoped soon to hear something good. M. de Talleyrand was all tenderness. He leant upon my shoulder. Certainly, at that moment, he thought me a very great man. It was not long before I received a note from M. de Duras. He wrote to me from Cambrai that the affair was arranged and that M. de Talleyrand would receive orders to start. This time the Prince did not fail to obey. What devil was prompting me? I had not followed the King, who had, so to speak, offered or rather given me the ministry of his household, and who was offended at my obstinacy in remaining at Mons. I was breaking my neck on behalf of M. de Talleyrand, whom I hardly knew, whom I did not esteem, whom I did not admire. For M. de Talleyrand, who was about to enter into combinations quite different from mine, who lived in an atmosphere of corruption in which I could not breathe. It was from Mons itself, amid all his worries, that the Prince de Bénévent sent M. de Perret to Naples to receive the millions of one of his Viennese bargains. M. de Blacas was at the same time travelling with the Naples embassy in his pocket, and some other millions which the generous exile of Ghent had given him at Mons. I had kept on good terms with M. de Blacas precisely because everybody detested him. I had incurred M. de Talleyrand's friendship for my fidelity to a whim of his mood. Louis XVIII. Had positively called me about his person, and I preferred the baseness of a faithless man to the King's favour. It was only too just that I should receive the reward of my stupidity, that I should be abandoned by all for having tried to serve all. I returned to France without the wherewithal to pay my journey, while treasures poured down upon those in disgrace. I deserved that correction. It is very well to fence one's way as a poor knight when the whole world is cased in gold, but still one must not make enormous mistakes. Had I remained with the King, the combination of the Talleyrand and Fouché ministry would have become almost impossible. Had the Restoration commenced with a moral and honourable mystery, all the combinations of the future might have been different. My carelessness of my own person deceived me as to the importance of facts. The majority of men have the fault of reckoning themselves too high. I have the fault of not reckoning myself high enough. I wrap myself in my habitual disdain of my fortune. I ought to have seen that the fortune of France was at that moment linked with that of my small destinies. Such entanglements are very common in history. Leaving Mons at last, I arrived at Cateau Cambrésis. M. de Talleyrand joined me there. We seemed as though we had come to remake the treaty of peace of 1559 between Henry II. Of France and Philip II. Of Spain. At Cambrai it appeared that the Marquis de la Suze, a quartermaster of the time of Fénelon, had disposed of the billets of Madame de Lévis, Madame de Chateaubriand, and myself. We remained in the street, in the midst of the bonfires, of the crowd circulating around us, and of the inhabitants crying, "Long live the King!" A student, hearing that I was there, took us to his mother's house. The friends of the different monarchies of France were beginning to make their appearance. They were not coming to Cambrai for the league against Venice, but to combine against the new constitutions. They were hastening to lay at the King's feet their successive loyalties and their hatred of the Charter, a passport which they considered necessary with Monsieur. I and 2 or 3 reasonable Gileses already smelt of Jacobinism. On the 28th of June appeared the Declaration of Cambrai. In it the King said: "I wish to remove from my person only those men whose reputation is a subject of grief to France and of dismay to Europe." Now behold, the name of Fouché was pronounced with gratitude by the Pavillon Marsan. The King laughed at his brother's new passion and said: "He has not received it by divine inspiration." I have already told you that when passing through Cambrai after the 100 days, I vainly sought my lodging of the time of the Navarre regiment, and the coffee house which I frequented with La Martinière. All had vanished with my youth. From Cambrai we went to sleep at Roye. The mistress of the inn took Madame de Chateaubriand for Madame la Dauphine. She was carried in triumph to a large room, in which stood a table laid for 30 persons. The room, lighted by wax candles, tallow candles, and a great fire, was stifling. The hostess did not wish to receive payment, and said: "I look askance at myself for not having got myself guillotined for our kings." Last spark of a fire which had animated the French for so many centuries. General Lamotte, brother-in-law to M. Laborie, came, dispatched by the authorities of the capital, to tell us that it would be impossible for us to appear in Paris without the tricolor cockade. M. de Lafayette and other commissaries, very ill received, for the rest, by allies, went fawning from one staff office to the other, begging from the foreigners for a master of some sort for France. Any king, at the Cossack's own option, would do excellently, provided that he did not descend from St. Louis and Louis XIV. At Roye we held a council. M. de Talleyrand had a pair of hacks put to his carriage and went to the King's. His equipage took up the width of the square, from the Minister's Inn to the King's door. He stepped out of his car with a memorandum, which he read to us. He considered the course we should have to follow on our arrival. He ventured a few words on the necessity of admitting all, without distinction, to the distribution of places. He hinted that we might extend our generosity as far as the judges of Louis XVI. His Majesty coloured, and striking the 2 arms of his chair with both hands, cried: "Never!" A never of 24 hours. At Senlis we called at a canon's. His servant maid received us like dogs. As to the canon, who was not St. Regulus, the patron saint of the town, he would not so much as look at us. His maid had orders to show us no other service than to buy us something to eat, for our own money. The Génie du Christianisme availed me nothing. Yet Senlis ought to have been of good omen to us, since it was in that town that Henry IV. Escaped from the hands of his jailers in 1576. "I have no regret," exclaimed the King, who was Montaigne's fellow countryman, as he made his escape, "save for 2 things which I have left in Paris: the Mass and my wife." From Senlis we went to the birthplace of Philip Augustus, otherwise Gonesse. On approaching the village, we saw 2 persons coming towards us. It was Marshal Macdonald and my faithful friend, Hyde de Neuville. They stopped our carriage and asked us where M. de Talleyrand was. They made no difficulties about telling me that they were looking for him, in order to inform the King that His Majesty must not think of passing the gates before he had taken Fouché as his minister. Anxiety came over me, for, in spite of the manner in which Louis XVIII. Had pronounced himself at Weir, I did not feel greatly reassured. I questioned the marshal. "What, Monsieur le Maréchal?" I asked. "Is it certain that we cannot return except on such harsh conditions?" "Faith, Monsieur le Vicomte," replied the marshal, "I am not quite convinced of it." The King stopped 2 hours at Gonesse. I left Madame de Chateaubriand in her carriage in the middle of the high road, and went to the council at the mayor's offices. There a measure was brought under deliberation, upon which depended the future fate of the monarchy. The discussion began. I, alone with M. Beugnot, maintained that in no case ought Louis XVIII. To admit M. Fouché to his councils. The King listened. I saw that he would have liked to keep his word given at Roye, but he was absorbed by Monsieur and driven by the Duke of Wellington. In a chapter of the Monarchie selon la Charte, I have recapitulated the reasons upon which I laid stress at Gonesse. I was excited. The spoken word has a strength which becomes weaker in the written word. Wherever an open tribune exists, I said, in this chapter, no one liable to be exposed to reproaches of a certain kind can be placed at the head of the government. There are certain speeches, certain phrases, which would oblige such a minister to resign on leaving the chamber. This impossibility, resulting from the free principle of representative government, was not felt at a time when all illusions united to place a famous man in office, notwithstanding the too well-founded repugnance of the Crown. The rise of that man was bound to produce one of these two things, either the abolition of the Charter or the fall of the ministry at the opening of the session. Can one picture the minister to whom I refer, listening in the Chamber of Deputies to the discussion concerning the 21st of January, liable every moment to be apostrophized by some deputy from Lyons, and always threatened with the terrible "Tu es Weir"? Men of that kind cannot be employed ostensibly, except with the mutes of the Seraglio of Bajazet or the mutes of the legislative body of Bonaparte. What will become of the minister if a deputy, ascending the tribune with a moniteur in his hand, reads the report of the Convention of the 9th of August 1795, if he demands the expulsion of Fouché as unworthy by virtue of that report which ejected him, Fouché, I am quoting literally, as a thief and a terrorist, whose atrocious and criminal conduct conferred dishonour and opprobrium upon any assembly whatever of which he became a member? Those are the things which have been forgotten. After all, supposing they had had the misfortune to think that a man of that kind could ever be useful, they ought to have kept him behind the scenes, consulted his deplorable experience. But to do violence to the Crown and to public opinion, in a barefaced manner to summon such a minister as that to affairs, a man whom Bonaparte at that very moment treated as infamous, was that not to declare that they disclaimed liberty and virtue? Is a crown worth so great a sacrifice? It left them powerless to remove anybody. Whom could they exclude after accepting Fouché? Parties acted without thinking of the form of government which they had adopted. Every one spoke of the Constitution, of liberty, of equality, of the right of peoples, and no one wanted them. Fashionable verbiage, one asked, without thinking, for news of the Charter, hoping all the time that it would soon die the death. Liberals and Royalists leant towards absolute government, modified by our habits. Such is the temper and trend of France. Material interest prevailed. They did not want, they said, to disown what had been done during the Revolution. Each was burdened with his own life and claimed the right to load his neighbour with it. Evil, they asserted, had become an element in public life which must thenceforth combine with the governments and enter as a vital principle into society. My crotchet, relative to a charter set in motion by religious and moral action, was the cause of the ill will which certain parties have borne me. For the Royalists, I was too much attached to liberty. For the revolutionaries, I had too great a scorn for crimes. Had I not been there, to my great detriment, to make myself the schoolmaster of constitutionalism, the Ultras and the Jacobins would from the earliest days have put the Charter into the pocket of their fleury dress-coats or their carmagnoles à la Cassius. M. de Talleyrand had no liking for M. Fouché. M. Fouché detested and, strangest of all, despised M. de Talleyrand. It was difficult to achieve that success. M. de Talleyrand, who at first would have been pleased not to be coupled to M. Fouché, feeling that the latter was inevitable, consented to the proposal. He did not perceive that, with the Charter, especially when he was united with the man of the Lyons grape-shot, he was hardly more possible than Fouché. Promptly, what I had declared was verified. They obtained no profit from the admission of the Duc d'Otrante. They obtained nothing but opprobrium. The approaching shadow of the Chambers was enough to cause the disappearance of ministers too much exposed to the plain speaking of the tribune. My opposition was of no avail. According to the custom of weak characters, the King closed the sitting without deciding anything. The order in council was to be settled at the Château d'Arnouville. No council, strictly speaking, was held at this last residence. Only the intimates and those associated with the secret were assembled. M. de Talleyrand, having distanced us, entered into intelligence with his friends. The Duke of Wellington arrived. I saw him drive past in a calash. The plumes of his hat waved in the air. He had come to confer with M. Fouché and M. de Talleyrand upon France, as a twofold present which the Battle of Waterloo was making to our country. When it was represented to him that the regicide of M. le Duc d'Otrante was perhaps a drawback, he replied: "That's a trifle. An Irish Protestant, an English general unacquainted with our manners and our history, a mind seeing in the French year 1793 only the English President of the year 1649, was charged to shape our destinies. Bonaparte's ambition had reduced us to this state of wretchedness. I rambled by myself in the gardens which the Controller General Machaut left, at the age of 93 years, to go and die at the Madelonnettes, for death in his great review passed none over then. I was no longer sent for. The familiarities of a common misfortune had ceased between the sovereign and the subject. The King was getting ready to return to his palace, I to my retreat. The vacuum forms anew round monarchs so soon as they recover their power. I have rarely passed, without making serious reflections, through the silent and uninhabited rooms of the Tuileries which led me to the King's closet. For me, deserts of another kind, infinite solitudes in which the very worlds vanish before God, the only real being. Bread was scarce at Arnouville, but for an officer named Dubourg, who was hurrying away from Ghent like ourselves, we should have fasted. M. Dubourg went marauding. He brought us back half a sheep to the house of the mayor, who had run away. If the servant of the mayor, a heroine of Beauvais left alone, had had any arms, she would have received us like Jeanne Hachette. We proceeded to Saint-Denis. Along both sides of the roadway stretched the bivouacs of the Prussians and English. In the distance, the eye met the spires of the abbey. Into its foundations Dagobert threw his jewels. In its vaults the successive dynasties buried their kings and their great men. 4 months since, we had laid the bones of Louis XVI, there to replace the other dust. When I returned from my first exile in 1800, I had crossed this same plain of Saint-Denis. Then only Napoleon soldiers were encamped there. Frenchmen still took the place of the old bands of the Constable de Montmorency. A baker harboured us. In the evening, at 9 o'clock, I went to pay my court to the King. His Majesty was lodged in the Abbey buildings. They had all the difficulty in the world to prevent the little girls of the Legion of Honour from crying, "Long live Napoleon!" I first entered the church. A piece of wall adjoining the cloister had fallen. The old abbey church was lit only by a lamp. I said my prayer at the entrance to the vault where I had seen Louis XVI lowered. Full of dread as to the future, I do not know that I ever felt my heart drowned in a more profound and more religious melancholy. Next I went to His Majesty's. Shown into one of the rooms which preceded the King's, I found no one there. I sat down in a corner and waited. Suddenly a door opened. Silently Vice entered, leaning on the arm of crime, M. de Talleyrand walking supported by M. Fouché. The infernal vision passed slowly before me, penetrated into the King's closet, and vanished. Fouché was coming to swear fealty and homage to his lord. The trusty regicide, on his knees, laid the hands which caused the head to fall of Louis XVI between the hands of the brother of the royal martyr. The apostate bishop was surety for the oath. On the next day, the Faubourg Saint-Germain arrived. Everything concerned itself with the nomination, already obtained, of Fouché. Religion as well as impiety, virtue as well as vice, the royalist as well as the revolutionary, the foreigner as well as the Frenchman. On every hand the cry was heard: "No safety for the King without Fouché! No salvation for France without Fouché! He alone has saved the country. He alone can complete his work." The old Duchesse de Duras was one of the noble dames who joined most eagerly in the paean. The Bailli de Crussol, a survivor of Malta, chimed in. He declared that, if his head was still on his shoulders, it was because M. Fouché had permitted it. The timorous ones had stood in such terror of Bonaparte that they had taken the butcher of Lyons for a Titus. During more than 3 months, the drawing-rooms of the Faubourg Saint-Germain looked upon me as a miscreant, because I disapproved of the nomination of their ministers. Poor people, they had prostrated themselves at the feet of the upstarts. They none the less made a great noise about their nobility, their hatred of the revolutionaries, their unshaken fidelity, the inflexibility of their principles. And they adored Fouché. Fouché had seen the incompatibility of his ministerial existence with the game of the representative monarchy. As he could not amalgamate with the elements of a legal government, he endeavoured to make the political elements homogeneous to his own nature. He had created a factitious terror. Inventing imaginary dangers, he made pretensions to oblige the Crown to recognise Bonaparte's 2 chambers and to receive the Declaration of Rights which had been hurriedly completed. A few words even were murmured as to the necessity of exiling Monsieur and his sons. To isolate the King would have been the masterpiece. People continued to be gulled. In vain the National Guard climbed over the walls of Paris and came to protest its devotion. It was asserted that this guard was ill-disposed. The faction had had the gates closed in order to prevent the population, which had remained royalist during the 100 Days, from hurrying up, and it was said that this population was threatening to butcher Louis XVIII on his way. The blindness was marvellous, for the French army was falling back upon the Loire. 150,000 allies occupied the outposts of the capital, and they continued to pretend that the king was not strong enough to penetrate into a city where not a soldier remained, where none was left but civilians, quite capable of restraining a handful of federates, if these had taken it into their heads to stir. Unfortunately, the king, through a series of fatal coincidences, seemed to be the leader of the English and Prussians. He thought himself surrounded with liberators, and he was accompanied by enemies. He appeared environed by an escort of honour, and this escort was in reality only the gendarmes taking him out of his kingdom. He was merely crossing Paris in the company of the foreigners whose memory would one day serve as a pretext for the banishment of his house. The provisional government formed after the abdication of Bonaparte was dissolved by means of a kind of indictment of the crown, a stepping-stone upon which it was hoped one day to build a new revolution. At the first Restoration, I was of opinion that the tricolour cockade should be kept. It was resplendent in all its glory. The white cockade was forgotten. By retaining colours warranted by so many triumphs, men were not preparing a rallying token for a coming revolution. Not to adopt the white cockade would have been wise. To abandon it after it had been worn by Bonaparte's own grenadiers was an act of cowardice. One cannot pass with impunity under the Caudine forks. That which dishonours is fatal. A slap in the face does you no harm physically, and yet it kills you. Before leaving Saint-Denis, I was received by the king and had the following conversation with him. "Well," said Louis XVIII., opening the dialogue with this exclamation. "Well, sire, you are taking the Duc d'Otrante?" I needs had to. From my brother down to the Bailli de Crussol, and the latter is not suspect, every one said that we could not do otherwise. What do you think? "Sire, the thing is done. I beg your Majesty's permission to say nothing." "No, no, speak. You know how I resisted since Ghent." "Sire, I only obey your orders. Pardon my loyalty. I think the monarchy is finished." The king kept silence. I was beginning to tremble at my boldness when His Majesty resumed: "Well, Monsieur de Chateaubriand, I am of your opinion." This conversation concludes my story of the 100 Days. End of Book 5, Part 2. Book 6, Part 1 of the Memoirs of Chateaubriand, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicole Lee. The Memoirs of Chateaubriand, Volume 3 by François-René de Chateaubriand, translated by Alexander Teixeira de Matos. Book 6, Part 1. Book 6. If a man were unexpectedly transported from life's most clamorous scenes to the silent shores of the Arctic Ocean, he would feel what I feel beside the tomb of Napoleon, for we find ourselves suddenly standing by the edge of that tomb. Leaving Paris on the 25th of June, Napoleon awaited at the Malmaison the moment of his departure from France. I returned to him, coming back to past days, anticipating future times. I shall not leave him again until after his death. The Malmaison, where the Emperor rested, was empty. Joséphine was dead. Bonaparte found himself alone in that retreat. There he had commenced his fortune, there he had been happy, there he had become intoxicated with the incense of the world. There, from the heart of his tomb, issued orders that shook the world. In those gardens where formerly the feet of the crowd raked up the sanded walks, the grass and brambles grew green. I had ascertained this when walking there. Already, for want of tending, the exotic trees were pining away. On the canals, the black Australian swans no longer floated. The cage no longer held the tropical birds prisoners. They had flown away to await their host in their own country. Bonaparte might, however, have found a subject of consolation by turning his eyes upon his early days. Fallen kings are afflicted above all because, looking upwards from their fall, they see only a splendid inheritance and the pomps of their cradle. But what did Napoleon discern prior to his prosperity? The manger of his birth in a Corsican village? Higher-minded, when flinging off the purple mantle, he would have proudly resumed the goat-herd scion. But men do not place themselves back at their origin when it was humble. It seems that an unjust heaven deprives them of their patrimony when, in fate's lottery, they do naught but lose what they have won. And nevertheless, Napoleon's greatness arises from the fact that he had started from himself. None of his blood had gone before him and prepared his power. At the sight of those abandoned gardens, of those untenanted apartments, of those galleries faded by the routs, of those rooms in which song and music had ceased, Napoleon was able to go over his career. He was able to ask himself whether, with a little more moderation, he might not have preserved his delights. Foreigners, enemies, were not banishing him now. He was not departing as a quasi-victor, leaving the nations in admiration of his passage after the prodigious campaign of 1814. He was retiring beaten. Frenchmen, friends, were demanding his immediate abdication, urging his departure, refusing even to have him as a general, sending him messenger after messenger to oblige him to quit the soil over which he had shed as much glory as scourges. Added to this harsh lesson came other warnings. The Prussians were prowling around the neighbourhood of the Malmaison. Blücher, full of wine, staggering, ordered them to seize, to hang the conqueror who had put his foot on the neck of kings. The rapidity of the fortunes, the vulgarity of the manners, the promptness of the elevation and degradation of the personages of today will, I fear, take away a part of the nobility of history. Rome and Greece did not speak of hanging Alexander and Caesar. The scenes which had taken place in 1814 were renewed in 1815, but with something more offensive, because the ingrates were stimulated by fear. It was necessary to get rid of Napoleon quickly. The Allies were arriving. Alexander was not there, at first, to temper the triumph and curb the insolence of fortune. Paris was no more adorned with its lustral inviolability. A first invasion had profaned the sanctuary. It was no longer God's anger that fell upon us. It was the contempt of heaven. The human thunderbolt was spent. All the cowardly characters had acquired a new degree of malignity through the 100 Days. Affecting to raise themselves, through love of the country, above personal attachments, they exclaimed that it was really too criminal of Bonaparte to have violated the treaties of 1814. But were not the true culprits those who had countenanced his designs? Suppose that, in 1815, instead of getting new armies for him, after forsaking him once only to forsake him again, they had said to him, when he came to sleep at the Tuileries, "You have been deceived by your genius. Opinion is no longer with you. Take pity on France. Retire after this last visit to the country. Go and live in the land of Washington. Who knows that the Bourbons will not make mistakes? Who knows that, one day, France will not turn her eyes towards you when, in the school of liberty, you shall have learnt to respect the laws? You will then return, not as a ravisher swooping on his prey, but as a great citizen, the pacificator of his country." They did not hold that language to them. They humoured the passions of their returned leader. They contributed to blinding him, sure as they were of benefiting by either his victory or his defeat. The soldier alone died for Napoleon with admirable sincerity. The rest was but a grazing herd, growing fat to right and left. If at least the viziers of the despoiled caliph had been satisfied to turn their backs on him! But no, they reaped profit from his last moments, they overwhelmed him with their sordid demands, all wanted to make money out of his poverty. Never was a more complete abandonment. Bonaparte had given cause for it. He was insensible to the troubles of others. The world paid him with indifference for indifference. Like most despots, he was on good terms with his domestics. At bottom he cared for nobody. A solitary man, he sufficed unto himself. Misfortune did nothing, except to restore him to the desert which was his life. When I gather up my memories, when I recollect having seen Washington in his little house at Philadelphia and Bonaparte in his palaces, it seems to me that Washington, retiring to his field in Virginia, cannot have experienced the searchings of conscience of Bonaparte, awaiting exile in his gardens at the Malmaison. Nothing was altered in the life of the first. He relapsed into his modest habits. He had not raised himself above the happiness of the husbandman whom he had freed. All was subverted in the life of the second. Napoleon left the Malmaison accompanied by Generals Bertrand, Rovigo and Becker, the latter in the quality of inspector or commissary. On the way, he was seized with a wish to stop at Rambouillet. He left it to take ship at Rochefort. as did Charles X. to take ship at Cherbourg. Rambouillet, the inglorious retreat where all that was greatest in men or dynasties was eclipsed, the fatal spot where Francis I died, where Henry III, escaping from the barricades, slept booted and spurred in passing, where Louis XVI left his shadow. How happy would Louis, Napoleon and Charles have been, had they been only the humble keepers of the herds of Rambouillet. On arriving at Rochefort, Napoleon hesitated. The Executive Commission was sending imperative orders. "The garrisons of Rochefort and the Rochelle," said the dispatches, "must use main force to make Napoleon take ship. Employ force, make him go. His services cannot be accepted." Napoleon's services could not be accepted! And had you not accepted his bounties and his chains? Napoleon did not go away, he was driven out. And by whom? Bonaparte had believed only in fortune. He banned misfortune ab igne et aqua. He had acquitted the ungrateful in advance. A just retaliation made him appear before his own system. When success, ceasing to animate his person, became incarnate in another individual, the disciples abandoned the master for the school. I, who believe in the legitimacy of benefits and the sovereignty of misfortune, had I served Bonaparte, I would not have left him. I would have proved to him by my fidelity the falseness of his political principles. Sharing his disgrace, I would have remained by his side as a living contradiction of his barren doctrines and of the worthlessness of the right of prosperity. Frigates had been waiting for him in the Rochefort roadstead since the 1st of July. Hopes which never die, memories inseparable from a last farewell, kept him back. How he must have regretted the days of his childhood, when his clear eyes had not yet known the first raindrops! He left time for the English fleet to approach. He was still able to embark on 2 luggers which were to join a Danish ship at sea. This was the course which his brother Joseph took. But decision failed him when he looked at the coast of France. He felt an aversion for a republic. The liberty and equality of the United States were repugnant to him. He inclined towards asking shelter of the English. "What disadvantage do you see in that course?" he asked of those whom he consulted. "The disadvantage of dishonouring yourself," answered a naval officer. "You must not fall, even dead, into the hands of the English. They will have you stuffed and show you at a shilling a head." Notwithstanding these observations, the Emperor resolved to give himself up to his conquerors. On the 13th of July, when Louis XVIII had already been 5 days in Paris, Napoleon sent the captain of the English ship Bellerophon the following letter for the Prince Regent: "Royal Highness, a victim to the factions which distract my country and to the enmity of the greatest powers in Europe, I have terminated my political career, and I come, like Themistocles, to throw myself upon the hospitality of the British people. I put myself under the protection of their laws, which I claim from your Royal Highness as the most powerful, the most constant, and the most generous of my enemies." Rochefort, 13th July 1815. If Bonaparte had not, during 20 years, overwhelmed with outrages the British people, its government, its king, and the heir of that king, one might find a certain propriety of tone in this letter. But how had this Royal Highness, so long despised, so long insulted by Napoleon, suddenly become the most powerful, the most constant and the most generous of enemies by the mere fact that he was victorious? Napoleon could not be persuaded of what he was saying, and that which is not true is not eloquent. The phrase setting forth the fact of a fallen greatness addressing itself to an enemy is fine. The well-worn instance of Themistocles is superfluous. The step taken by Napoleon shows something worse than a lack of sincerity. It shows neglect of France. The Emperor busied himself only with his individual catastrophe. When the fall came, we no longer counted for anything in his eyes. Without reflecting that, by giving the preference to England over America, his choice became an outrage to the mourning of the country, he begged a shelter of the government which for 20 years had kept Europe in its pay against ourselves, of the government whose commissary with the Russian army, General Wilson, urged Kutuzov, in the retreat from Moscow, to exterminate us completely. The English, successful in the final battle, were encamped in the Bois de Boulogne. Go then, O Themistocles, to seat yourself quietly by the British hearth, while the soil has not yet finished drinking in the French blood shed for you at Waterloo. What part would the fugitive, feasted, maybe, have played on the banks of the Thames, in the face of France invaded, of Wellington become dictator at the Louvre? Napoleon's high fortune served him better. The English, allowing themselves to be carried towards a narrow and spiteful policy, missed their final triumph. Instead of undoing their supplicant by admitting him to their fortresses or their banquets, they rendered more brilliant for posterity the crown which they believed they had snatched from him. He grew greater in his captivity through the enormous affright of the powers. The ocean enchained him in vain. Europe in arms camped on the shore, her eyes fixed upon the sea. On the 15th of July, the Épervier conveyed Bonaparte to the Bellerophon. The French craft was so small that, from the deck of the English ship, they did not see the giant on the waves. The Emperor, accosting Captain Maitland, said to him, "I come to place myself under the protection of the laws of England." Once, at least, the contemner of the laws confessed their authority. The fleet set sail for Torbay. A multitude of shipping cruised around the Bellerophon. The same eagerness was shown at Plymouth. On the 30th of July, Lord Keith handed the applicant the act confining him at St. Helena. "It is worse than Tamerlane's cage," said Napoleon. This violation of the law of nations and of the respect due to hospitality was revolting. If you see the light on board of any ship, provided it be under sail, you are English born. By virtue of the old London customs, the waves are considered soil of Albion. And an English ship was not an inviolable altar for a supplicant. It did not place the great man who embraced the poop of the Bellerophon under the protection of the British trident. Bonaparte protested. He argued about laws, talked of treachery and perfidy, appealed to the future. Did that become him? Had he not laughed at justice? Had he not, in his might, trampled under foot the sacred things whose guarantee he now invoked? Had he not carried off Toussaint Louverture and the King of Spain? Had he not had English travellers arrested who happened to be in France at the time of the rupture of the Peace of Amiens, and kept them prisoners for years? Allowable, therefore, to mercantile England to imitate what he had done himself and to use ignoble reprisals. But they might have acted differently. With Napoleon, the size of the heart did not correspond with the width of the head. His quarrels with the English are deplorable. They revolt Lord Byron. How could he condescend to honour his jailers with a word? One suffers at seeing him stoop to wordy conflicts with Lord Keith at Torbay, with Sir Hudson Lowe at St. Helena, publish statements because they break faith with him, cavil about a title, about a little more or a little less, gold or honours. Bonaparte, reduced to himself, was reduced to his glory, and that ought to suffice him. He had nothing to ask of men. He did not treat adversity despotically enough. One would have pardoned him for making of misfortune his last slave. I find nothing remarkable in his protest against the violation of hospitality, save the date and signature of that protest. On board the Bellerophon, at sea, Napoleon. There are harmonies of immensity. From the Bellerophon, Bonaparte crossed on to the Northumberland. 2 frigates laden with the future garrison of St. Helena escorted him. Some of the officers of that garrison had fought at Waterloo. They permitted that explorer of the globe to keep with him Monsieur and Madame Bertrand, Messieurs de Montholon, Gourgaud and de Las Cases, voluntary and generous passengers on the submerged plank. By one clause in the captain's instructions, Bonaparte must be disarmed. Napoleon alone, a prisoner on board ship in the midst of the ocean, disarmed. What a magnificent terror of his power! But what a lesson from heaven to men who abuse the sword! The stupid Admiralty treated the great convict of the human race as a Botany Bay felon. Did the Black Prince disarm King John? The squadron weighed anchor. Since the bark which carried Cæsar, no ship had been laden with so great a destiny. Bonaparte was approaching that sea of miracles upon which the Arab of Mount Sinai had seen him pass. The last French land that Napoleon discerned was Cap la Hogue, another trophy of the English. The Emperor had been mistaken in the interest of his memory when he wished to remain in Europe. He would soon have been only a vulgar or faded prisoner. His old rôle was ended. But beyond that rôle, a new position revivified him with a new renown. No man of universal fame has had an end similar to Napoleon's. He was not, as after his first fall, proclaimed autocrat of a few quarries of iron and marble, the first to furnish him with a sword, the second with a statue. An eagle? He was given a rock on the point of which he remained in the sunlight till his death, in full view of the whole world. At the moment when Bonaparte is quitting Europe, in which he is giving up his life to go in search of the destinies of his death, it is well to examine this man of two existences, to depict the false and the true Napoleon. They blend and form a whole from the mixture of their reality and their falsehood. From the conjunction of these remarks it results that Bonaparte was a poet in action, an immense genius in war, an indefatigable, able and intelligent spirit in administration, a laborious and rational legislator. That is why he has so great a hold on the imagination of peoples and so much authority over the judgment of practical men. But as a politician, he will always appear deficient in the eyes of statesmen. This observation, which has escaped the majority of his panegyrists, will, I am convinced, become the definite opinion that will survive concerning him. It will explain the contrast between his prodigious actions and their pitiful results. At St. Helena, he himself severely condemned his political conduct on 2 points: the Spanish War and the Russian War. He might have extended his confession to other delinquencies. His enthusiasts will perhaps not maintain that, when blaming himself, he was mistaken in himself. Let us recapitulate. Bonaparte acted contrary to all prudence, not to speak again of the hatefulness of the action. In killing the Duc d'Enghien, he attached a weight to his life. Notwithstanding the puerile apologists, this death, as we have seen, was a secret leaven of the discords that subsequently burst out between Alexander and Napoleon, as also between Prussia and France. The attempt upon Spain was completely improper. The Peninsula was the Emperor's. He could turn it to the most advantageous account. Instead of that, he turned it into a school for the English soldiers and into the cause of his own destruction through the rising of a people. The detention of the Pope and the annexation of the States of the Church to France were but the caprice of tyranny, through which he lost the advantage of passing for the restorer of religion. Bonaparte did not stop, as he should have done, when he had married the daughter of the Caesars. Russia and England were crying mercy to him. He did not revive Poland, when the safety of Europe depended on the restoration of that kingdom. Madness having once set in, he went on from Smolensk. Everything told him that he must not go further at his first step, that his first northern campaign was finished, and that the second, as he himself felt, would make him master of the empire of the Tsars. He was able neither to compute the days nor to foresee the effect of the climactic changes, which every one at Moscow computed and foresaw. See above what I have said of the continental blockade and the Confederation of the Rhine. The first, a gigantic conception, but a questionable act; the second, an important work, but spoilt in the execution by the camp instinct and the fiscal spirit. Napoleon inherited the old French monarchy, as the centuries and an uninterrupted succession of great men had made it, as the majesty of Louis XIV. And the alliances of Louis XV. Had left it, as the Republic had enlarged it. He seated himself on that magnificent pedestal, stretched out his arms, laid hold of the peoples and gathered them around him. But he lost Europe with as much suddenness as he had taken it. He twice brought the Allies to Paris, notwithstanding the marvels of his military intelligence. He had the world under his feet, and all he got from it was a prison for himself, exile for his family, the loss of all his conquests, and of a portion of the old French soil. Here is history proved by facts and deniable by none. Whence arose the faults which I have just pointed out, followed by so quick and so fatal a catastrophe? They arose from Bonaparte's imperfectness as a politician. In his alliances, he enchained the governments only with concessions of territory, of which he soon altered the boundaries, constantly displaying the reservation to take back what he had given, ever making the oppressor felt. In his invasions, he reorganized nothing, Italy excepted. Instead of stopping at every step to raise up again, under another shape, what he had overthrown, he did not discontinue his movement of progression among ruins. He went so fast that he scarce had the time to breathe where he passed through. If, by a sort of Treaty of Westphalia, he had settled and assured the existence of the States in Germany, in Prussia, in Poland, at his first retrograde march he would have leant his back against contented populations and have found shelters. But his poetic edifice of victories, lacking a base and suspended in mid-air only by his genius, fell when his genius came to retire. The Macedonian founded empires in his course. Bonaparte, in his course, knew only how to destroy them. His sole aim was to be, in his own person, the master of the globe, without troubling his head about the means of preserving it. Men have tried to make of Bonaparte a perfect being, a type of sentiment, of delicacy, of morality and of justice. A writer like Caesar and Thucydides, an orator and an historian like Demosthenes and Tacitus. Napoleon's public speeches, his phrases in the tent or the council chamber, are so much the less inspired with the breath of prophecy, in that what they foretell by way of catastrophes has not been accomplished, while the Isaiah of the sword has himself disappeared. Writings on the wall which pursue states, without catching and destroying them, remain puerile, instead of being sublime. Bonaparte was truly destiny during 16 years. Destiny is mute, and Bonaparte ought to have been so. Bonaparte was not Caesar. His education was neither learned nor select. Half a foreigner, he was ignorant of the first words of our language. What mattered, after all, that his speech was faulty? He gave the password to the universe. His bulletins have the eloquence of victory. Sometimes, in the intoxication of success, they made a show of drafting them on a drumhead. From amid the most mournful accents arose fatal bursts of laughter. I have read with attention all that Bonaparte has written: the early manuscripts of his childhood, his novels, next his letters to Buttafuoco, the Souper de Beaucaire, his private letters to Joséphine, the 5 volumes of his speeches, his orders and his bulletins, his dispatches left unpublished and spoilt by the editing in M. de Talleyrand's offices. I know something of these matters. I have found scarcely any thoughts resembling the great islander's nature, except in a scrap of autograph left behind at Elba. My heart denies itself to common joys as to ordinary pain. Not having given myself life, I shall not rob myself of it, so long as it will have me. My evil genius appeared to me and foretold my end, which I found at Leipzig. I have laid the terrible spirit of innovation which was overrunning the world. That most certainly is genuine Bonaparte. If the bulletins, the dispatches, the allocutions, the proclamations of Bonaparte are distinguished for energy, this energy did not belong to him in his own right. It was of his time. It came from the revolutionary inspiration, which grew weaker in Bonaparte because he marched counter to that inspiration. Danton said, "The metal is boiling over. If you do not watch the furnace, you will all be scalded." Saint-Just said, "Dare." That word contains the whole policy of our revolution. They who make revolutions by halves only dig a grave. Do Bonaparte's bulletins rise above that pride of speech? As for the numerous volumes published under the title of Memoirs de Saint-Hélène, Napoleon dans l'exil, etc., those documents, gathered from Bonaparte's mouth or dictated by him to different persons, contain a few fine passages on actions of war, a few remarkable appreciations of certain men. But in the upshot, Napoleon is occupied only in making his apology, in justifying his past, in basing on commonplace ideas accomplished events and things of which he had never dreamt during the course of those events. In this compilation, in which pros and cons succeed one another, in which every opinion finds a favourable authority and a peremptory refutation, it is difficult to separate that which belongs to Napoleon from that which belongs to his secretaries. It is probable that he had a different version for each of them, in order that readers might choose according to their taste and, in the future, create for themselves Napoleons to their liking. He dictated his history as he wished to leave it. He was an author writing articles on his own work. Nothing, therefore, could be more absurd than to go into ecstasies over chronicles by different hands, which are not, like Caesar's Commentaries, a short work, springing from a great head, written by a superior writer. And yet those brief commentaries, as in his Paulo thought, were neither faithful nor exact. The Mémorial de Saint-Hélène is good, allowing liberally for the candour and simplicity of the admiration. One of the things that contributed most to render Napoleon hateful during his life was his inclination for debasing everything. In a fired city, he would couple decrees on the re-establishing of a few comedians with fiats which suppress monarchs, a parody of the omnipotence of God, who rules the lot of the world and of an ant. With the fall of empires, he mingled insults to women. He delighted in the humiliation of what he had overthrown. He calumniated and wounded particularly all that had dared to resist him. His arrogance was equal to his luck. The more he lowered others, the greater he believed himself to appear. Jealous of his generals, he accused them of his own mistakes, for, as for himself, he was infallible. Despising all merits, he reproached them harshly with their errors. He would never have said, after the disaster of Ramillies, as Louis XIV said to the Maréchal de Villeroy, "Monsieur le Maréchal, at our age, one is not lucky." A touching magnanimity of which Napoleon knew nothing. The century of Louis XIV was made by Louis the Great. Bonaparte made his century. The history of the Empire, changed by false traditions, will be yet further falsified by the state of society during the imperial epoch. Any revolution written in the presence of the liberty of the press can allow the eye to probe to the bottom of facts, because each one reports them as he has seen them. The reign of Cromwell is known because it was customary to say to the Protector what one thought of his acts and his person. In France, even under the Revolution, despite the inexorable censorship of the executioner, The truth came out. The triumphing faction was not always the same; it soon succumbed, and the faction which succeeded it taught you what its predecessor had hidden from you. There was liberty from one scaffold to the other, between the cutting off of two heads. But when Bonaparte seized upon the power, when thought was gagged, when one heard nothing but the voice of a despotism which spoke only to praise itself, and allowed only itself to be spoken of, truth disappeared. The would-be authentic documents of that time are tainted. Nothing was published, books or newspapers, save by the master's order. Bonaparte saw to the articles in the Moniteur. His prefect sent back from the various departments the recitals, the congratulations, the felicitations, in the form in which the Paris authorities had dictated and forwarded them, in which form they expressed a conventional public opinion, quite different from the real opinion. Write history from such documents as those. In proof of your impartial studies, quote the authentic sources to which you have gone. You will only be quoting a lie in support of a lie. If it were possible to call this universal imposture into question, if men who have not seen the days of the Empire were to insist upon regarding as sincere all that they come upon in printed documents, or even all that they might dig up in certain boxes at the public offices, it would be enough to appeal to an unexceptionable witness, to the Conservative Senate. There, in the decree which I have quoted above, you have seen its own words. Taking into consideration that the liberty of the press has been constantly submitted to the arbitrary censorship of his police, and that at the same time he has always made use of the press to fill France and Europe with fabricated facts and false maxims, that acts and reports passed by the Senate have undergone alterations when made public, etc., is there any reply possible to this declaration? The life of Bonaparte was an incontestable truth, which imposture had taken upon itself to write. A monstrous pride and an incessant affectation spoil Napoleon's character. At the time of his dominion, what need had he to exaggerate his stature when the God of armies had furnished him with the war chariot whose wheels are living? He took after the Italian blood. His nature was complex. Great men, a very small family upon earth, unhappily find only themselves to imitate them. At once a model and a copy, a real personage and an actor representing that personage. Napoleon was his own mime. He would not have believed himself a hero if he had not dressed himself up in a hero's costume. This curious weakness gives something false and equivocal to his astonishing realities. One is afraid of taking the King of Kings for Roscius, or Roscius for the King of Kings. Napoleon's qualities are so much adulterated in the gazettes, the pamphlets, the poems, and even in the songs overrun with imperialism, that those qualities are completely unrecognisable. All the touching things ascribed to Bonaparte in the Anna, about the prisoners, the dead, the soldiers, are idle trash to which the actions of his life give the lie. The Grand-mère of my illustrious friend Béranger is only an admirable ballad. Bonaparte had nothing of the good fellow about him. Dominion personified. He was hard. That coldness formed the antidote to his fiery imagination. He found in himself no word, he found only a deed, and a deed ready to chafe at the smallest independence. A gnat that flew without his orders was a rebellious insect in his eyes. It was not enough to lie to the ears, it was necessary to lie to the eyes. Here, in an engraving, we see Bonaparte taking off his hat to the Austrian wounded. There we have a little Toulourou, who prevents the Emperor from passing. Further on, Napoleon touches the plague-stricken of Jaffa, and he never touched them. He crosses Mount St. Bernard on a spirited horse, amid a whirl of snowflakes, and it was the finest weather in the world. Are they not now trying to transform the Emperor into a Roman of the early days of the Aventine, into a missionary of liberty, into a citizen who instituted slavery only for love of the opposite virtue? Draw your conclusions from two features of the great founder of equality. He ordered his brother Jerome's marriage with Miss Patterson to be annulled, because the brother of Napoleon could ally himself only with the blood of princes. Later, after returning from the Isle of Elba, he invested the new democratic constitution with a peerage and crowned it with the Additional Act. That Bonaparte, following up the successes of the Revolution, everywhere disseminated principles of independence, that his victories helped to relax the bonds between the peoples and the kings, and snatch those peoples from the power of the old customs and the ancient ideas, that, in this sense, he contributed to the social enfranchisement, these are facts which I do not pretend to contest, but that, of his own will, he laboured scientifically for the political and civil deliverance of the nations, that he established the narrowest despotism with the idea of giving to Europe and to France, in particular, the widest constitution, that he was only a tribune disguised as a tyrant. All this is a supposition which I cannot possibly adopt. Bonaparte, like the race of princes, desired nothing and sought nothing save power, attaining it, however, through liberty, because he made his first appearance on the world stage in 1793. The Revolution, which was Napoleon's wet nurse, did not long delay in appearing to him as an enemy. He never ceased beating her. The Emperor, for the rest, knew evil very well, when the evil did not come directly from the Emperor, for he was not destitute of moral sense. The sophism put forward concerning Bonaparte's love for liberty proves only one thing: the abuse which can be made of reason. Nowadays it lends itself to everything. Is it not established that the Terror was a time of humanity? In fact, were they not demanding the abolition of the death penalty while they were killing everybody? Have not great civilizers, as they are called, always immolated men? And is it not therefore, as far as has been proved, that Robespierre was the continuer of Jesus Christ? The Emperor meddled with everything. His intelligence never rested. He had a sort of perpetual agitation of ideas. In the impetuousness of his nature, instead of a free and continuous train, he advanced by leaps and bounds. He flung himself upon the universe and shook it. He would have none of it, of that universe, if he was obliged to wait for it, an incomprehensible being who found the secret of debasing his most towering actions by despising them, and who raised his least elevated actions to his own level, impatient of will, patient of character, incomplete and as though unfinished. Napoleon had gaps in his genius. His understanding resembled the sky of that other hemisphere under which he was to go to die, the sky whose stars are separated by empty spaces. One asks oneself by what spell Bonaparte, so aristocratic, so hostile to the people, came to achieve the popularity which he enjoyed. For that forger of yokes has most certainly remained popular with a nation whose pretension was to raise altars to independence and equality. Here is the solution of the enigma. Daily experience makes us recognise that the French are instinctively drawn towards power. They do not love liberty. Equality alone is their idol. Now, equality and despotism have secret connections. In those two respects, Napoleon had his fount in the hearts of the French, militarily inclined towards dominion, democratically enamoured of the level. Once on the throne, he made the people sit down beside him. A proletarian king, he humbled the kings and nobles in his antechambers. He levelled the ranks, not by lowering, but by raising them. The descending level would have charmed the plebeian envy more. The ascending level was more flattering to its pride. French vanity was puffed up also by the superiority which Bonaparte gave us over the rest of Europe. Another cause of Napoleon's popularity has to do with the affliction of his last days. After his death, as men became better acquainted with what he had suffered at St. Helena, they began to be moved. They forgot his tyranny to remember that, after conquering our enemies, after subsequently drawing them into France, he had defended us against them. We imagined that he might save us today from the disgrace into which we have sunk. His fame was recalled to us by his misfortune, his glory profited by his adversity. Lastly, the marvels of his arms have bewitched the young, while teaching us to worship brute force. His unexampled fortune has left to the overweening conceit of every ambition the hope of arriving at the point which he attained. And yet this man, so popular through the roller which he had passed over France, was the mortal enemy of equality and the greatest organizer of aristocracy within democracy. I cannot acquiesce in the false praises with which men have insulted Bonaparte, while trying to justify everything in his conduct. I cannot surrender my reason, nor go into ecstasies before that which arouses my horror or my pity. If I have succeeded in conveying what I have felt, there will remain of my portrait one of the leading figures in history. But I have adopted no part of the fantastic creature composed of lies, lies which I saw born, lies which, taken at first for what they were, passed in time to the state of truth through the infatuation and the imbecile credulity of mankind. I refuse to be a gull and to fall into a fit with admiration. I strive to paint persons conscientiously, without taking from them what they have, without giving them what they have not. If success were esteemed as innocence, if, debauching even posterity, it loaded it with its chains, if a future slave, begotten by a slavish past, that suborned posterity became the accomplice of whosoever should have triumphed, where would be the right? Where would be the reward of sacrifice? Good and evil becoming only relative qualities, all morality would be blotted out from human actions. That is a difficulty which is caused to the impartial writer by a brilliant renown. He keeps it on one side as much as he can in order to lay bare the truth, but the glory returns like a golden haze and instantly covers the picture. In order not to admit the diminution of territory and power which we owe to Bonaparte, the present generation consoles itself by imagining that he has given back to us in illustriousness what he has taken from us in strength. Are we not, from this time forward, it asks, famed in the four quarters of the earth? Is not a Frenchman feared, remarked, sought out, known on every shore? But were we placed between those two conditions, either immortality without power, or power without immortality? Alexander made the Greek name known to the universe. None the less, he left them 4 empires in Asia. The language and civilization of the Hellenes extended from the Nile to Babylon and from Babylon to the Indus. At his death, his ancestral kingdom of Macedon, far from being diminished, had increased 100-fold in force. Bonaparte made us known on every shore. Commanded by him, the French threw Europe so low at their feet that France still prevails by her name, and that the Art de l'Étoile can rise up without appearing a puerile trophy. But, before our reverses, that monument would have stood as a witness, instead of being only a record. And yet, had not Dumouriez, with raw recruits, given the foreigner his first lessons, Jourdan won the Battle of Fleurus, Pichegru conquered Belgium and Holland, Hoche crossed the Rhine, Massena triumphed at Zurich, Moreau at Hohenlinden, all exploits most difficult to obtain and preliminary to others. Bonaparte made a corporate whole of these scattered successes. He continued them. He caused those victories to shine forth. But without those first wonders, would he have obtained the last? He was raised above all things only when reason with him was executing the inspirations of the poet. Our sovereign's illustriousness cost us merely 200,000 or 300,000 men a year. We paid for it with merely 3 millions of our soldiers. Our fellow citizens bought it merely at the cost of their sufferings and their liberties during 15 years. Can such trifles count? Are the generations that have come after us not resplendent? So much the worse for those who have disappeared. The calamities under the Republic served for the safety of all. Our misfortunes under the Empire did much more. They deified Bonaparte. That is enough for us. That is not enough for me. I will not stoop so low as to hide my nation behind Bonaparte. He did not make France. France made him. No talent, no superiority will ever bring me to consent to the power which can, with one word, deprive me of my independence, my home, my friends. If I do not say of my fortune and my honour, it is because one's fortune does not appear to me to be worth the trouble of defending it. As for honour, it escapes tyranny. It is the soul of the martyrs. Bonds encompass and do not enchain it. It pierces the vault of prisons and carries the whole man away with it. The wrong which true philosophy will never forgive Bonaparte is that he accustomed society to passive obedience, thrust back humanity towards the times of moral degradation, and perhaps corrupted characters in such a way that it would be impossible to say when men's hearts will begin to throb with generous sentiments. The weakness in which we are plunged as regards Europe, our actual abasement, are the result of the Napoleonic slavery. All that remains to us is the faculty to bear the yoke. Bonaparte unsettled even the future. It would not surprise me if, in the discomfort of our impotence, we were seen to grow smaller, to barricade ourselves against Europe instead of going to seek it out, to give up our freedom within to deliver ourselves from an illusory terror without, to lose ourselves in ignoble provident cares contrary to our genius and to the 14 centuries which compose our national manners. The despotism which Bonaparte left in the air will descend upon us in the shape of fortresses. The fashion nowadays is to greet liberty with a sardonic smile, to look upon it as a piece of old lumber, fallen into disuse with honour. I am not in the fashion. I think that there is nothing in the world without liberty. It gives a price to life. Were I to remain the last to defend it, I would never cease to proclaim its rights. To attack Napoleon in the name of things that are past, to assail him with ideas that are dead, is to prepare fresh triumphs for him. He is to be fought only with something greater than himself, liberty. He was guilty towards it, and consequently towards the human race. Vain words. Better than any do I feel their uselessness. Henceforth, any observation, however moderate it may be, is reputed profane. It needs courage to dare brave the cries of the vulgar, not to be afraid of being treated as a narrow intelligence, incapable of understanding and feeling the genius of Napoleon, for the sole reason that, in the midst of the lively and real admiration which one professes for him, one is nevertheless not able to worship all his imperfections. The world belongs to Bonaparte. That of which the ravisher was unable to complete the conquest, his fame usurps. Living, he missed the world; dead, he possesses it. It is vain for you to protest. The generations pass by without listening to you. Antiquity makes the son of Priam say to the shade, "Judge not Hector from his little tomb." The Iliad, Homer, the Greeks in flight, see there my sepulchre. I am buried under all those great deeds. Bonaparte is no longer the real Bonaparte, but a legendary figure, put together from the vagaries of the poet, the talk of the soldier, and the tales of the people. It is the Charlemagne and the Alexander of the idylls of the Middle Ages that we behold to-day. That fantastic hero will remain the real personage. The other portraits will disappear. Bonaparte is so strongly connected with absolute dominion that, after undergoing the despotism of his person, we have to undergo the despotism of his memory. This latter despotism is more overbearing than the former; for, though men fought against Napoleon when he was on the throne, there is an universal agreement to accept the irons which he flings to us now that he is dead. He is an obstacle to future events. How could a power issuing from the camps establish itself after him? Has he not killed all military glory by surpassing it? How could a free government come into being, when he has corrupted the principles of all liberty in men's hearts? No legitimate power is now able to drive the usurping spectre from the mind of man. The soldier and the citizen, the republican and the monarchist, the rich and the poor alike place busts and portraits of Napoleon in their homes, in their palaces or in their cottages. The former conquered are in agreement with the former conquerors. One cannot take a step in Italy without coming across him. One cannot enter Germany without meeting him, for in that country the young generation which rejected him is past. Generally, the centuries sit down before the portrait of a great man. They finish it by means of a long and successive work. This time, the human race has declined to wait. Perhaps it was in too great a hurry to stump a crayon drawing. It is time to place the completed side of the idol in juxtaposition with the defective side. Bonaparte is not great through his words, his speeches, his writings, through the love of liberty which he never possessed and which he never pretended to establish. He is great in that he created a regular and powerful government, a code of laws adopted in different countries, courts of law, schools, a strong, active, intelligent administration which still lasts us. He is great in that he revived, enlightened and governed Italy superlatively well. He is great in that, in France, he restored order from the midst of chaos, in that he built up the altars, in that he reduced furious demagogues, vain-glorious scholars, anarchical men of letters, Voltairean atheists, open-air orators, cut-throats of the prisons and streets, starvelings of the tribune, the clubs and the scaffolds, in that he reduced them to serve under him. He is great in that he curbed an anarchical mob. He is great in that he put an end to the familiarities of a common fortune, in that he forced soldiers, his equals and captains, his chiefs or his rivals, to bend before his will. He is great, above all, in that he was born of himself alone, in that he was able with no other authority than that of his genius, able, he, to make himself obeyed by 36 million subjects at a time when no illusion surrounds the thrones. He is great in that he overthrew all the kings his opponents, in that he defeated all the armies, whatever the difference in their discipline and valour, in that he taught his name to savage as well as to civilized peoples, in that he surpassed all the conquerors who preceded him, in that he filled 10 years with prodigies so great that we have difficulty to-day in understanding them. The famous offender in triumphal matter is no more. The few men who still understand noble sentiments can do justice to glory without fearing it, but without repenting of having proclaimed what that glory had that was baleful, without recognising the destroyer of independences as the father of emancipations. Napoleon does not need that one should ascribe merits to him. He was richly enough endowed at his birth. Now, therefore, that, severed from his time, his history is ended and his idyll commencing, let us go to see him die. Let us leave Europe, Let us follow him beneath the sky of his apotheosis. The hissing of the seas where his ships have struck sail will point out to us the spot of his disappearance. At the extremity of our hemisphere, says Tacitus, is heard the sound made by the dipping sun. Sonum in super immergentis audiri. End of Book 6, Part 1.